We are back with APIM or APIM Hotrod. I'm Massimo Cripa. I'm here with my dear friend Stephane Eskens. Last time was the episode 1, and we started with the security part, the security area in the very famous map of Stephane, and we discussed about different network options, and we went a bit into details about VIP and DIP. And today we stay stick to security, right, Stephane? How are you?
Yes, hello Massimo. Happy to be back in the show. So for this indeed episode 2. So I will actually indeed maybe restart from the map, so where we were last time. So basically indeed, as you highlighted, we covered the network piece a bit, different options we have with regards to pricing tiers. Key takeaways from last time is that at this stage, but of course you have to pay attention when you watch this recording, at this stage, let's say in March 2024, the only full-blown option that we have to, let's say, fully integrate with the VNet for both inbound and outbound is still the premium and dev tier, of course, but dev is for non-prod. That is one thing. And then another takeaway where I, let's say, explained in depth the concept of VIP and DIP, so static IPs and let's say dynamic IPs. The takeaway from that one was to not mix different instances of API management into the same subnet, because then it would lead to a situation where you cannot identify which APIM is talking to you from a network perspective, at least.
Especially if those instances are different environment, right?
Indeed, that was really a situation that I met, I encountered in the real world, and indeed, so they wanted to strengthen a little bit their security controls, and then okay, they had an issue because of that. So that's indeed a good recap from last time. Today I think we're gonna focus on, let's say, the different branches that we have here. So still in the security. So that was a network piece. So I closed it for sake of easiness, let's say. So today we're going to talk about some policies that are typically used. Let's say in any API, let's say that you expose, you typically will use 2-3 policies. But maybe very quickly, so there is no demo. There will be a demo actually today, but here there is no demo for this. So in terms of TLS capabilities, basically APIM is quite rich from that perspective. It can do TLS termination. It supports custom certificate authorities, which can always be handy if you interact with, let's say, for instance, on-premise backend signed with, your own authority. It supports custom domains. It also supports MTLS for both clients, so meaning it's able to validate client certificates from your consumers, but also it is able to authenticate. So take a client certificate to authenticate against backend. So that's very commonly used actually. And we have different APIs here. And we also have something that's brand new, and I think Massimo, you have some slides about this one. Which is Defender for API. So before, let's say, diving into a more concrete demo on some policies, maybe it's interesting, Massimo, if you could share some info about Defender for API. So floor is yours, Massimo, to introduce that topic.
Okay, thank you, Stephane. So Defender for API is something that has been, let's say, launched last year, so it's pretty recent, and it enables to add security to your APIs just by a single click. So it's really well integrated. It's the same story as the whole Defender family. But if you look at it from API management point of view, you can imagine that it's like using a log to event hub policy, but that policy is not used. So everything that is going from your API management gateway to the backend API and all the way back, it's automatically forwarded, so mirrored to the Defender for API backend. So by enabling the Defender on that specific instance of API management, then you can select which APIs you want to onboard, then the traffic will be forwarded to Defender. Once the traffic is forwarded, you can then, Defender will be able to assess the security posture of your API by doing, for example, a baseline configuration check. So he will double check if your API management is set up according to the best practices. he will do some authentication check. Is your API authenticated, yes or no? So are you have something that every API should have, so authentication, or are you exposing personal information on an unprotected API? And then also he will give you some insights about security, your sensitive data. On the other hand, we have the advanced threat protection. So it's a set of machine learning, let's say, checks that will look at your traffic, the pattern, and will cover let's say, the OWASP top 10 classic API protection. Not web protection, the one that are focused for APIs. So that's how it works. So just transparent traffic mirroring. That's what is important from this. So I wanted to bring to this episode just a couple of, let's say, alerts that has been catched by running Defender for APIs in production. But first, before going to those alerts, one of the nice things that I was mentioning in the previous slide is about personal information. A lot of organizations are running APIs, but most of the time, or a lot of times, people are wondering, oh, am I exposing personal information, yes or no? What you see here, the data classification on the right, is pretty interesting and nice. So in this case, per operation, you can understand which type of personal information is exposed. In this case, is fine. I can see that I have a personal, like in this case, I have a bank account number together with an authenticated operations or API. And that's good. Just suppose that you have something not authenticated with API, that will be a total disaster. That's one of the things that the tool surfaces to you. And here I have an example, which is an example of scenarios, an example of alerts that you might have. In this case, suppose that you have your API has some path parameter in your URL, and in this case, it shows that normally this parameter was used with 1,000, let's say, of different values, and then out of the blue, it went from in the last 20 minutes, it went from 10,000 to 20,000. That might be something that a sign of something wrong with authorization, but in that case, it was a legitimate traffic. You can imagine that it was the case, like suppose that there is a sort of promotion, and this promotion in a shop related to a sort of game, and everybody goes more to play on that website. And to simplify, let's see this parameter as a sort of session ID. So people play more, so there are more sessions. So the tool sees different value for that parameter, and it feels like something is wrong, but it was just a new promotion on let's say, on this retail example.
Yeah, but at least it will show some unusual patterns, let's say.
Yes, it check unusual things. You need to run this tool for, we ran it for 6 weeks to just get these results, to give the model the time to train, to get enough data, and have all the deviation clear. Thank you, Stephane. And one last that I also here I wanted to show, that was on a classic spike. So a certain API or a certain operation was called not a lot. So suppose in this case 800. So it's really not a lot in 20 minutes, 800 times, and then 71 times, and then it went to 800. Also in this case, it was just this case was pretty interesting, because there were a sort of error in the code. So in the code of the front end, so we were able to catch an error by seeing this sudden increase of traffic, even if the traffic is not a lot, of course. But for that specific operation, it was a put, so an update of a certain let's say account page. So it was good to find this error. But in general, when we see a spike in traffic, and that brings me to policies in API management, it's always or what I recommend is to always use rate limiting, always throttle. And then it comes up the very super classic question. Okay, should I rate limit for IP address, user, or agent? I don't know, a combination of them, all of these kind of things. Of course, there are pros and cons. Most of the time, or what I see is the combination of them, depending also on which kind of authentication you are using.
Yeah.
But the point here, one of the things is like, it's really important, I believe, to rate differently when you have 200 or a successful call, and rate even harder when you have errors, because you might really save yourself from a brute force attack and these kind of things by limiting harder the errors.
Yeah. That's a good point. I know. Yeah, good. So I guess yeah. So that was a nice introduction to Defender, of Defender to for API. So I think indeed that guy will really be helpful, because I made a few audits in my life, and I could see many backend services lacking some authorization for some operations, sometimes for entire controllers, and actually nobody really noticed. But if you combine this with the fact that you might be exposed to internet, then you can guess the impact of such a security hole. So I think that just also having the assessment of whether your endpoints are subject to authorization or not is already a big step forward, and that will really help prevent, let's say, accidental exposure of endpoints, let's say. So maybe if we switch back, let's say, to the map for a second.
Yeah, but Stefan, I want
Yeah.
to ask you
So
something.
yeah,
Sorry.
tell me.
I
Yeah.
know that when you see a rate limiting with IP address, you got sick. Of
Yeah.
course, this
Well,
is an example, but
yeah. Yeah, I actually plan to show this, but indeed, so maybe I can explain it, because indeed you already showed the policy. Now, the thing is that there could be a risk by using the IP address, and I think it also depends on the consumption. So if you, for instance, have a B2C API, meaning that the consumers are just you and me, a native app on the mobile device, for instance, right? And the client is a mobile device, and let's say your customers are just Lambda people, well, they might actually be behind a hotspot at some point, in a city or something, and so they might all come from the same IP. And so that could lead to a situation where you would actually block people legitimate calls, let's say, just because they are somehow behind an IP that is, let's say, shared, right? So that's then a risky key, let's say, to choose from. So in that case, you should indeed try to at least combine some conditions. But what I typically try to do, when, of course, whenever it's possible, is to rate based on an access token that you receive, right? And that I could show actually after, because that will allow you to distinguish the user or the partner, right? Because if you register apps for partners, each partner will have its own app, let's say, registered in your IDP. And so then you would only rate, let's say, that user or that partner, and not everybody. You see, so that's why I try to avoid the IP address, let's say,
We are
as a key.
completely on the same page of this. That was on purpose. Of
Yeah,
course, again, if you case by case, if you need the
indeed.
IP address, always evaluate with a combination of IP address and, as you were saying,
Yeah,
some information that might come from other headers, from other
yeah,
part of the message. I
yeah.
get back to you, Stefan. Thank you with your wonderful map. Here you are.
No problem. Thank you, Massimo. So maybe indeed. So I think so. As I said, it's really good that Defender will assess at least if your endpoints are secured or not. So in terms of authorization mechanism, so what you really have to distinguish is what type of consumer is consuming your API. So that's actually what I just said. So if the consumer is a client, by client I mean, for instance, a mobile device, it could be a browser for single page apps, for instance, or if the consumer is a server, you will typically leverage different capabilities. When you, for instance, subscription keys, so that it's clear for everyone, you should not use subscription keys on the mobile device. Why? Because a subscription key is typically something shared. You don't have one key per user. And of course, so that you have to see the subscription key as a secret somehow, and the secret is not a safe place, let's say, to save such secret on the mobile device where you could always sniff traffic. Yeah. So if no, you really have one subscription key per user, which is typically never the case, then you could be doing this, but typically you try to avoid this kind of thing. So you need to then, that's why I made this split here between consumer as a server, consumer as a client. So typical practices, if it's a server you could use, so like API to API call, like your internal kitchen, in your own backends, then of course subscription key is good enough. There is something, but it's still considered a weak, let's say, authorization mechanism. It's more for usage tracking that you would still use a subscription key or together with something else. There is a quite legacy grant called the resource owner password grant. You should also try to avoid this one. This is a bit the equivalent of a service account, right? So it actually represents a user, but not a human user, like with a username password. In some rare cases, you might still be forced to use that if the resource that you target does not support anything else, right? Sometimes still happens, but it's less and less the case. Of course, for server to server communication, typically what you have is that we use something called the client credential grant. Okay. And that is, let's say, with client ID, client secret. Nowadays, more and more people are familiar with that. And you have something that is actually higher than this. It's actually called certificate bound access tokens, but that is not natively supported by Azure AD. But that's something that you could consider depending on the IDP you are using, you are working with. And that's really the top secure, let's say, way of authenticating two servers together. Of course, we have MTLS that is old already, right? It's with a client certificate. So the calling party has to present a certificate that you trust. Yeah? And APIM, as I showed earlier, supports MTLS in both. So as to validate incoming certificates, but also to authenticate using a certificate. And if it's a client, you would also have MTLS. That's also still a possibility today on corporate-owned devices. It's a bit old school, but that's still something you could see on the field, that the company would deploy a company certificate on each device, right? And so we rely on this to identify a corporate device from non-corporate devices. And then something, so that's why I put a star here. The implicit grant flow, you might have still see that, Massimo. This is an old school, let's say it's already a legacy, but we have more and more legacy in the cloud as well. And that was actually the flow that was typically used back in the days of ADAL for, let's say, SPAs, so single page apps. You might still see this, but you should not use that anymore. Okay, this is considered not robust enough in terms of security, and you should basically try to always use PKCE, which is proof of key exchange. So it will actually add a key between the client and the server, for the authorization server, just to make sure that the client is the one it pretends to be, let's say. Okay, so that's a bit the flow. So I think you can also find this at your own pace and discover this, but that's really important to see, let's say, what authorization mechanism we have. And then maybe something that's interesting, so no demo for this, but it's something called the credential manager in APIM that allows API management to authenticate for you against third-party services. Well, whatever you want, basically. It supports a lot of different flavors. And then API management will manage tokens for you. Will cache them, store them. It's going to be its internal kitchen. And so that can be a seamless way to integrate API management with other backends. Could be GitHub, could be Azure AD, it could be different stuff, Entra ID. So, okay, that was one thing. So I already mentioned a little bit the TLS earlier. And then, of course, as Massimo was already showing in the Defender for API, so policies are basically the way to enforce controls. Controls or transformations, whatever you want to enforce, let's say, with API management, you would do that with policies. You, of course, have to try to stick to something simple, no business logic in there, try to keep it simple. And so in terms of validation for, let's say, OpenID Connect. This is this branch here. You have, and that's the is really used often. We have, of course, validation things, so like validation of tokens, right? And for Azure AD specific tokens as well. And then we have, by the way, Microsoft has not renamed this to validate Entra ID token. No, it's just a joke. So, but maybe it will come. It will be a breaking change, so I doubt. Anyway, in token acquisition, so it's actually if you use, for instance, this this policy, that will actually link to the credential manager I was showing earlier. So you have a lot of policies there. So maybe, Massimo, I think we have time for a 5 minutes demo, right? To see that in action.
Go
Okay,
ahead. I'm
good.
looking for it.
So what I did, let me switch to API management. Where are you, API management? Not on the right page, sorry. So it's the other window. Wait, I have to transfer, sorry. Sorry, I will try to do it this way. Do you see my screen? I guess so.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, good. Okay, because I don't see you anymore, but anyway, it doesn't matter, it should be okay. So I registered a few apps in Entra ID, and so one of these apps is actually an API at the same time. So what I wanted to show is, let's say, this something that also I had in the real world, let's say, which was a bit challenging. So if we see this policy, it's the typical validate JWT policy, but typically what you do, for sake of time, I will not demo it completely, but typically you typically don't use this way of, let's say, getting the keys. You actually do something. I'll just reuse the IntelliSense so that it will go faster. If you take this one, you see by default, you have this attribute here, the OpenID config, where you have to put the metadata endpoint of the OIDC IDP. So for instance, if it's Entra ID, you could get this endpoint from Entra ID. And what it does is that API management will basically call that endpoint and it will discover, I can do it because this is this endpoint here. It will discover what the capabilities of the API of the IDP, sorry, but also let's say where the keys are, because of course when Azure AD or any IDP issues tokens, it signs those tokens, right? And so it will sign the tokens with its private keys, but then for you to validate these tokens, you will actually check with the public key, you would be able to check the signature, verify the signature. And so this is this metadata endpoint. So if you put that URL in API management, then APIM will actually call this IDP for you, pull the keys, cache them during an hour, because otherwise you would have a round trip to the IDP for every API call, which is not something you want. And that's all good. But you might, and that's actually the preferred way of working. But you might have situations where you don't have connectivity between APIM and the IDP. So I happened to have that one day. And so in that case, well, then you cannot use the OIDC metadata endpoint. So you have to basically dump the keys and store them. So here, for sake of easiness, let's say I basically, let me see, I think I went a bit too far. Okay, it's still there. Thanks. Thanks, Control Z. So you would actually have to pull the keys from the IDP. Here I've just hard-coded it just for sake of the demo, but you would typically store that in named values, for instance. That doesn't need to be in key vault because it's a public key, so there is nothing secret about this one. But where do you get those keys? And that was actually not so easy to actually understand that getting the key is okay, but how do you do that in APIM? That was not so easy to see that you have to use these attributes, the N and basically the other key, which is the E key, right? So these are really linked to encryption mechanism. And so I actually added these comments here. Well, I don't know, we could maybe share something, or I could share that in the GitHub as well. But you see, so that's basically these keys that you need to specify to make available in the context of APIM. So to get those keys, you typically go to basically this endpoint here. So it's JW key. Yeah, this one. Okay, so that's, let's say, what you need to look for. And every OIDC compliant, let's say, IDP will have this, right? And so then here you have all the keys from Azure AD. So then you still need to find which key is used for what. But you have, for instance, the use is signature and so on. So this is what the key is doing. And then you would find the values here with the E, you see, and the, let's say, the other attributes, you would find those here. And so then you can store them in APIM. So it could be just named values. One risk of this approach is that, of course, if the IDP is rotating the keys, then you would have to rotate the keys here as well, for sure. Of course, if you are in control of the IDP, it might be easier, which was the case in my situation where the IDP was a customer managed key cloak, so nothing to see with Microsoft, but still it's a usual suspect key cloak as well. And basically that's how we got, let's say, the keys. So that's a tip I wanted to show. And then, of course, what we do here, it's typically called coarse grain validation. So again, that should be simple here. So you should not go to ultra complex validation at this stage. So APIM, the goal is just to block every illegal call. If you really need fine grained authorization, either you do that in the backend, right? Because the backend service itself should be agnostic to whether there is an APIM or not in front of it, right? Because maybe tomorrow the architecture changes, and then if your backend does not validate anything, then you might be at risk. Either if you really decide to say all validation happens in APIM or an API gateway in general, then if it becomes too complex, you should offload this to a dedicated backend that would just be used for validation. But always consider performance impact, of course. And then if you would do that, also see if caching can play a role, just to make sure you don't harm performance. Because if you delegate that or offload that to a specific backend, it means that you will call, let's say, that backend for every API call. Again, I have to think about this as well. So let's maybe see this in action. So here, what I did is simply validating, of course, I have the keys of the issuer, in this case, Entra ID. I validate the audience, which is in this case just the resource identifier. That's what the audience is. It could have multiple audiences per token. That's why it's an array. And of course, I'm validating the issuer. Which is, of course, Entra ID in this case. And I just make the coarse grain validation to say, okay, the app ID should be one of those three apps. So something also to keep in mind, for instance, for Entra ID, it will not, you need to validate the app ID because Entra will actually not validate this. So if you ask a token with another app, right, that is not listed here, that was not intended to be a consumer of your API, if the app exists and you provide valid client credentials, and the scope that you target is also a valid scope, so the resource identifier in this case for up to server to server, it will actually let it go and it will issue a token. So it's up to you to still validate these kind of things here. Otherwise, I could have an app that was not initially registered to consume that API. Okay, so that's something to pay attention to. So if we see that in action, if I go to Postman, let's say this is my API, right, where I define the policy that you've just seen. So if I just do send here, I have a 401 because I didn't not provide a valid token. So that's good enough. If basically I just grab a token with the client one, so I registered two clients, then I will have the token. I output this into a variable. So if I go back here and I do send, then you see now I have a 200 status. So, and now I will actually point to the throttling. So I will also open Fiddler just so that it would be easier to demo. Let me see. So you should see Fiddler as well. So I'll basically capture traffic, fine, and just now make another call again. And so it should be, it has been called by Fiddler, and I'll just replay this one like, I don't know, whatever, for 403 times. And you see here that I'm throttled. And that I'm throttled because I also defined another policy, which is a throttling policy here. So I did not did the status code, Massimo. I hope you will forgive me. But basically here, so I'm just saying, okay, we cannot do more than 15 calls per minute. And as a counter key, I'm extracting the subject from the token. And so why is that interesting? is simply because if we inspect the token for a second, we'll look at that claim. And so I think I have it here. And so I'm actually throttling based on that claim. And that claim, if the app is just for the client credential grant, so one of the flows, then the value of this guy will be the value of the object identifier of this app. So this is the app ID. It has an object ID in Entra, and that will be this object ID that you see here. So if you have 3 partners and you, let's say, throttle on that, well, if one partner or malicious actor on the partner side is actually abusing the system, or they have a bug or whatsoever, only that partner will be blocked. And so not the others. So if I do the demo again, so if I take, let's say, another, so that you see, I claim another token. So that's my up2. Okay, so let's say that was partner 1, that's partner 2. So now I just make an extra call to capture this guy. Okay, so if I do again, let me see here, I'll just already put that in the composer. So that's partner 2, right? If I now try to, I'll just copy it here. Let me do it the other way around. Sorry, I'll just do it again. That's gonna be the first entry, and now I'll do another one with partner 2. So what I want to show is that one is throttled and not the other. That's basically what I want to show here. So I take partner 1 here. So if I now replay this one, let's say 45 times, it will be blocked, right? But I can still replay this one, right? So if I go here, I will not be impacted. I should not be impacted by the throttling unless I did something wrong here. Yeah, you see, so I'm not throttled, right? So, and that's really why the IP address could be more at risk again if you have multiple legitimate users somehow, or even servers behind the same IP, which could also be the case at partner side if you have an outbound IP that is shared across servers. So Massimo, is that clear, that part?
Yeah, great, really great example. A great example when before we were talking about using a combination of value. A claim out of the JOT token is a great example. Of course, finding the right keys is very important. If you have a public or APIs that are using a subscription key or other things only, even if it's a weak security mechanism, even I'm shaking by quality security mechanism, an API key, I mean a subscription key, but voila. So we really have to make sure that we take the time to understand that depending on the API, what is the best key. But of course, I love it, the claims. So that's it's one of the best and more accurate, I would say.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, indeed. That's really, and so I'll just spend 2 extra minutes to explain one thing that I also see that is often misunderstood. That's more when you have a user interaction, because here it was server to server. So if I know, just start an app here to log in, right? So it's opening another screen, but I'll just put it here. So I'll just log in as a user this time, right? I think I call that hot user 1. I hope it was that. No, I'm not sure anymore. Let's see. And so even the password is still okay. Of course, I'll just skip the setup. It's for multi-factor and so on. Go ahead. So I want to show something. In this case, I should receive a token that this time will include some user information. So I will not consume APIM, but at least I will show you one thing. So in this case, if you take this token, then you will have the subject field. In this case, will represent not the object ID of that user, but some combination, but still something that will identify the user himself. So here again, if the user has been abused, his account was hacked whatsoever, only that user would be throttled in this case. So that's something important, but also something, as soon as you have a user, you will actually include scopes, right? Real scopes, let's see. And so something to keep in mind is that scopes were really designed to basically prompt the user and get the consent from a user about what the app, the client app that has been registered at the level of the IEP, is trying to do on behalf of the user against the resource. That's really the real purpose of scopes. And so I've seen quite often in backend services, I mean, in the code itself, developers just looking at scopes in tokens and that's it, not making any extra check. And that could be okay in some situations, but you have to remember that a scope is just something that allows the client app to interact on behalf of the user against a resource. It does not mean that the user himself has access to what the app is trying to do. So you should always double check in the backend if that is, let's say, if the user that is in that token has indeed the right to do what the app is trying to do on his behalf. And a very good example I always give to make sure people understand, if you would develop an app for Office 365 that you publish that on the marketplace and you say, my app needs to be able to do everything with Office 365, you require all the permissions, including, for instance, doing everything with SharePoint sites, like deleting site collections and so on. If the user that consents this app has just read-only permission onto one document library, of course, the app cannot create stuff on behalf of the user. Although the scope will be part of the token, SharePoint, of course, in that case, would just revalidate that the user for which the token was issued really has a permission. So you could not rely only on the scopes. That was a message I wanted to give because I see a big misunderstanding on that in the field, let's say. Massimo, floor is yours.
Yeah, great one. So I think we are at the back. Sorry, at the end of this episode 2. Yeah. It's always nice to dive into all of this, the security and all of these different aspects. So again, so a big thank you for your map. It's really, it helps, at least for me, that I'm a big visualizer, to navigate in the sea of API management. Yeah. And so I think we can close for today. And I want to say thank you and to you, Stephane, and to everybody is looking everybody will watch this episode. And voila, so see you.
We hope it will be helpful, and indeed it was very I was very happy to be here, Massimo. Thanks as well. And so I think we'll just go for a next episode anytime soon, right?
We'll again find new lessons from the field, new tricks, new edge cases, and we will share them with our audience.
Perfect. Thanks, Massimo.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stephane.
See you, everyone. Bye.